everyone. Happy Wednesday. Excuse me. I hope that everyone's having a pleasant week. My week's going all right. So I figured. Well, I'll get onto it in a moment. Um, right, I'm just gonna have a sip of my drink first. Today I am drinking another invisible drink. This time the mint julep, because I got a bunch of mint and I don't want to let it go to waste. Um, okay, so today I figured I would talk about this paper that just came out. It's in the Journal of Health Security, and it's by John T. O'Brien and Cassidy Nelson. Now, to report my kind of interest in this, so first of all, I am not very familiar with John O'Brien's work, but this paper looks very good, and I am interested in looking up a bit of his stuff. He kindly retweeted my post earlier. Let's see. So do go check him out. Um, like I say, it's a good paper, and I would suspect on the basis of this that the rest of his work is rather worth reading. Um, and yes, flexing with the mint julep indeed. I don't get a lot of mint at the moment, so it's a bit of a treat. Um, so his stuff seemed good, and kindly retweeted me. Cassidy Nelson doesn't seem to have as much of a Twitter presence. She doesn't post much, but I'm familiar with her from this recent 80,000 Hours podcast, in which she discusses, it's kind of framed in the context of COVID, but the actual advice and actual kind of policy prescriptions are pretty universal. Clearly, this is something she's been working on for some time prior to COVID, and while it's a useful framing device, um, I think this will continue being very relevant for some time to come. Uh, and Cassidy works at the Future of Humanity Institute currently, and I will be mentioning this a bit later. It's another paper in the same issue of the journal by friend of the show Anders Sandberg and Dr. Nelson, and together they go through an interesting kind of rough framework of how we can consider sort of dependent risk in um, like synthetic biology and similar areas, and kind of models the level of expertise required and what sort of level of expertise we would expect from a attacker based on different levels of availability of kind of tractability, um, of barrier to entry uh, available to an attacker. So I'll mention this a bit more later, though this isn't going to be my focus today. Um, so the part of the reason why I was particularly interested in this, and shout out to Gavin Taylor, by the way, whom I've chatted with a bit recently, met him through an EA Effective Altruist conference, and he put me on to this paper, which he mentioned was forthcoming. And ooh, looks interesting. I shall take a look at that later. Um, so this is particularly interesting to me because it sort of synergizes with and lines up with some of the stuff that I've been thinking about recently, and uh, I think does a better job of assessing the way that biorisk and AI interweave than I could have, and particularly gives me some interesting ideas for sort of jump off points for this. So I'm working on a paper with a friend of the show, Anders, on the on neuro risk, so the risk of and neurosecurity risk specifically, so the risk of attackers getting access to brain implants, as I mentioned in a recent stream, and thereby controlling behavior and affecting people and potentially having some very bad outcomes. So what we're looking at doing is kind of setting up a framework for considering neurosecurity beyond just like deep brain stimulation. So considering it more broadly in the context of current and future brain-computer interfaces, BCIs. And what this paper does is provides a very useful framework for conceptualizing and comparing different types of uh, biological risks and how they interface with AI, the risk posed by AI, and how those risks converge, i.e., well, as we'll see in a bit, how two risks become a greater risk than the sum of their parts, or two or more risks, I suppose, in this case, um, various domains of biotechnology and artificial intelligence. Um, so they go on to use a couple of examples, and one of them is, as we'll see, very relevant indeed to my interests. Um, and I suppose I should also mention they do cite me in this paper, which is obviously very nice. It's flattering that other people working in the field think that my work is worth referring to. And yeah, though if they hadn't done so, I would still be very interested in this because, as I say, it's relevant to some of the stuff I'm thinking about at the moment. So they start off just going over big data and AI a little bit, talking about machine learning, one of the techniques, approaches in AI, and specifically deep learning, which is so machine learning in general has been around for quite a while, but didn't have a huge amount of useful application until the early 2010s, when deep learning using uh, many layered networks of artificial neurons, taking a bit of a hint from neuroscience, of course, was implemented and propagated, and it led to this big leap in what AI can do and in its like practical applicability. And I'll try to dig it out later, but there's an interesting talk at the Effective Altruism conference recently, looking at the risk of AI developing very fast, of us developing artificial general intelligence in the next few years. And while that risk does seem low, it's probably not inconsiderable. And it goes through a lot of the potential bottlenecks. I'll dig it up now because I'm on stream. It's not like I'm super time limited. So Centre for Effective Altruism, they do a lot of very good YouTube videos, many interesting talks. Where's that coming through? So bring that over here, and so I watched some of these live. One of them here we go. This is one I watched back more recently. Um, so yeah, Asia Burgle talks. Let's see if I can. So she's got some estimates for genome intelligence and talks a bit about the different kind of patterns that we could look for in AI development, whether it's going to be a series of short bursts of activity followed by an AI winter, or one big burst that doesn't kind of stop until we get to AGI. And yeah, so this is why I'm referring to this. She discusses the tension between available compute, so the amount of computing resources that are available, and the kind of algorithmic efficiency, and how both of these drive the development of what we can do with AI. And this is pretty relevant in terms of both the AI side of things, but also um, relevant when we're considering biological technology. So this citation is for one of these classic graphs, or well, I'm not sure what the citation is for, but the thing they're referring to here is for these classic graphs of so the exponential decrease in the cost of sequencing a human genome is quite remarkable. Um, Here's the trajectory for Moore's law. Now we can argue about whether Moore's law has been keeping up and whatnot, but this is the kind of doubling every year and a half that Moore's law brings us. This is a logarithmic graph. Um, and the cost to sequence human genome from the Human Genome Project in 2001, first publishing their results, going down, it follows a roughly exponential decrease, and then we get to extremely rapid decrease that seems to have leveled out a bit now, but there are various technologies in the works that could drop that further. So over the course of 15 years, the cost to sequence a human genome went down by a factor of 100,000, which is quite remarkable. And while not every area of biotech is following that trajectory by any means, there is reason to be both optimistic and concerned, I suppose, that there will be other areas that will follow a similar trajectory. Um, Josh recently worked with a reputable mapping company to find the VP of engineering for new autonomous vehicle wing. The moral conundrums they talked us through was so fascinating. I'm locked into this. Cool, excellent, glad to hear it. And yeah, the moral implications of self-driving cars, the real life trolley problems, are concerning and fascinating in equal measure, I think. Um, so we can see in both AI and biotech things are going pretty fast, um, and in some areas much faster than others. So, for example, while um, we've it's been slow to develop, let's say, certain types of like semantic recognition in AI, though it seems to be going reasonably well. Uh, Visual learning went incredibly rapidly over the course of just a few years. We went from way, way below human performance to way above human performance in things like searching for specific people through CCTV footage. So we can see that a lot of these novel technologies can change the world in very profound ways, but it's difficult to predict what bit of them will change the world and how. And so forecasting is very important, and trying to do risk management and risk analysis as the authors are here. Um, so they bring up, so they talk about technical convergence, this idea of multiplicative or greater than additive effects of two technologies interacting. And this is a very important point generally in technological risk, is that lowering the, in this case, tacit knowledge required to undertake lab tests, but generally lowering the barrier to entry, democratizing a technology, is wonderful in many ways. And I don't think they are at all wrong here to, they in several points go through, or at least mention some of the wonderful benefits that we can expect from these technologies. But increasing access means that more people can use the technology for both good and ill. And which paper are they citing here? Okay, they don't talk about that till a little bit later on. But as I mentioned with the Sandberg and Nelson paper, um, the the sort of expected attacker who is able to bring about bad effects with any different technology goes down and down in the level of necessary skill as the technology becomes more democratized. Um, so they define convergence here. It's the technological commingling between life sciences and AI, or generally any two or more technologies, such that the power of their interaction is greater than the sum of their individual disciplines. Um, and yeah, this is, I think, a very important thing to consider. It's something I've been thinking about for a while, and they look at this, look at developing a framework for considering this risk, and then provide a few illustrative examples. So they discuss some of the limitations of existing frameworks for considering these kind of risks, and as they quite rightly point out, using frameworks, they provide a very useful uh, system for researchers thinking about these kind of problems, but also provide a useful uh, uh, method to explain them to decision makers and to allow decision makers to weigh risks that are heavily impacted by different specialist fields. Because, of course, decision makers can't reasonably be expected to be an expert on every different contributor to a, uh, a specific area of risk. Um, they raise the fact that it's very difficult to plan for the kind of adversary that one might be um, uh, one might be interested in. And yeah, so JTIBS says here, I feel like most of academia use the word forecasting very broadly on the temporal axis. Yeah, that's absolutely fair. And something they do in this framework is have a explicit section, which we'll get to later, for the horizon that we're looking at. And I think that's extremely important because, and it's something I try to drill in when I'm talking about brainjacking and neurosecurity. Um, Essentially, bottom of cobbler shaker makes for a very fine julep glass or julep cup when you don't have a dedicated julep cup, which is obviously a big failing of my bar. Terribly embarrassing. Anyway, so yeah, it's something I try to explain constantly when talking about neurosecurity is that the risk that I'm forecasting isn't, you know, that Granny's Parkinson's implant tomorrow is going to have some nefarious, Russian hacker, Zuckerblatt, turns it off and she dies. That's not something I'm concerned about. Um, I mean, it's not impossible, as I think demonstrated in my paper from several years back. It is technically feasible, but the actual risk, the bulk of the risk at least that I'm worried about is in scenarios that are many years or indeed decades down the line. Um, but, and this is something I very much agree with the authors here, but I don't think that means that we shouldn't be considering it. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But yeah, so they discuss some of the existing frameworks that can be used to assess relevant risks. Excuse me, don't want to hear my burps. Um, and I've encountered this one before. I'm not familiar with the other two previously, although the kind of risk analysis stuff um, isn't so much my area of expertise. That's something I'm wanting to go into a bit more. Um, but they basically, without going too much into it, they basically explain that each one of these has a fair amount of limitation for the kind of exercise that we're wanting to undertake, and that it would be useful to have a framework for considering, for comparing different types of biological risks. Um, so important to note that the examples they provide are supposed to be illustrative examples and not proposing a taxonomy, which is I'm somewhat glad at because within neurosecurity, part of my hopefully forthcoming paper that I'm currently working on with Anders is going to be providing a bit of a taxonomy of neurosecurity risks. So I'm glad they haven't just gone and tried to provide a detailed overview of every possible type of risk. Otherwise, my paper would be, well, actually, to be fair, it would probably be better if that got published earlier. So, while my pride might be wounded, if they had published that, I would prefer it to be published now than in 6 months, a year, or whenever it's done on my end. But you know, there's at least a kind of an upside to that. But of the illustrative examples, I think they chose some particularly interesting and worthwhile ones, not least because one of them is risk of medical neurological implant brain computer interface hijacking. So synthetic biology is probably the most widely discussed, and by widely discussed I mean almost not at all discussed, but still vaguely discussed, form of catastrophic biological risk, global catastrophic biological risk. Now, that's certainly not to say that we should be discussing synthetic biology risk less, but there are other areas of risk that aren't perhaps as obvious and that hopefully I'm going to publish on in the future. So they go through some of the existing methods that pose, or the existing kind of facts that pose catastrophic biological risks. We have DNA synthesis methods and gene editing technologies, which, though CRISPR-Cas9 does have its fair share of limitations, and we're seeing now that its propensity to cause off-target effects may be quite concerning. Nevertheless, it's a very powerful genetic technology and offers us a very extensive tool set for modifying genes. There have been several experiments which are necessary to point out in any paper on catastrophic biological risk that have involved de novo synthesis of various viruses, including horsepox, which is particularly concerning as it's a very close relative of smallpox. And small aside, for those who don't know, in I want to say 2014, the FDA discovered a, several vials, in fact, of variola, i.e., smallpox, hidden away in deep freeze in a biosafety level 3 lab that they were renovating. Now, there's only supposed to be two labs in the world, one in Novosibirsk and one in Atlanta, Georgia, where samples of smallpox are stored, and yet just sitting there in a freezer was a vial of variola major. Now, it's not ideal, not great, and access to that genome would enable, with the technology that's been demonstrated in horsepox, would enable an adversary to create potentially a live smallpox virus, which not good given the current extent of vaccination for smallpox. I believe North Korea is the only country in the world that that still actively vaccinates for smallpox, which might be related to their biological weapons program if it exists, which it probably does. But this research getting out there is certainly concerning. J. Tibbs says, by the way, I'm currently working on some stuff regarding facial recognition policy, so I'd consider coming on chat. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let me know when, or you'd be welcome to come on after I'm done discussing this. I'd love to chat. But yeah, just let me know when's good for you, and certainly facial recognition policy is an area of deep interest to me because it's the intersection of AI and the risk of totalitarianism. It's something that I've been long concerned about. So if you're doing policy work, I always love speaking to experts in the field. So please do. Yeah, I think bloody thing. Um, yeah, you're on the Discord, I believe, so feel free to message me on there or on Twitter or wherever. And yeah, absolutely, let's set that up. Um, so they go through some of the other techniques that are both wonderful and potentially great for developing new technologies and implementing new cures and so forth, but also potentially pose substantial risk. And they so again they uh, go they briefly mention the design steps of a biological attack and how improving access to certain steps um, can increase the risk of an attack taking place. Oh, wonderful! Yeah, in a month, absolutely. Would love to have you on. Yeah, just drop me a line whenever you're free, and obviously I will give the paper a shout out because I'm always happy to spread good memes. So cool. Um, so I'll briefly talk about the um, Sandberg and Nelson paper. Essentially, their idea is to do a Bayesian analysis of um, the kind of probability of each stage at getting past um, to the next stage. So, in order to commit a bioterror attack or to be a nation state who releases a bioweapon or whatever, you've got to come up with an insight of a particular target or a particular molecular target or particular vector or whatever that's going to be um, potentially effective, conceptualize that into a proper idea, like a coherent strategy, turn that into a genetic sequence in the case of synthetic biology, convert that into a viable biosystem, a virus or a bacterium or whatever, test it in animal models or humans as you prefer. Obviously, as a bioterrorist, you're probably not particularly concerned about the ethics of such testing. Disperse it through the population and reap the consequences. So each one of these steps has a certain barrier to entry. So often, not necessarily decreasing as it goes on, but say the insight, if you're not a pretty experienced, knowledgeable person in some area of biology, you're unlikely to come up with the initial insight to set off this change of events. But there are many insights and some ideas that are widely available in the biological literature or in fiction or in dark forum posts or whatever. So providing more access to those is going to make it easier to get on to the next stages. Likewise, increasing the capability and decreasing the cost of technology to provide genetic sequencing to produce a sequence of nucleotides is going to make it easier to get through that whole chain of steps. And they produce a mathematical model of how so this is actor power, the amount of ability to kind of affect the world the actor, the attacker in this scenario has. So we might imagine that kind of 10 to the 0 is your average everyday person who can look things up on Google, but doesn't know much beyond that. 10 to 1 might be a grad student, an undergraduate student. 10 to 2 might be a high quality grad student with access to a small lab. 10 to the 3 might be a professor, whatever. Um, it's probably a bit more spread out than that, but so we can see how this is lines based on a accessing a end consequence with a single step versus accessing it with 6 steps. So if you just had to say do dispersal rather than having to do all 6 of these, then the threshold at which an actor is able to undertake the attack shifts. Well, the amount of potential attackers available shifts rapidly to the left the fewer steps you have. So this is pretty intuitive, and they go through. I won't go through this in detail, not least because I should have Anders on to talk about this properly. He's hopefully going to be back on in a couple of weeks or something, so I'll ask him to go through this properly then. But for now, it's just worth knowing that reducing the difficulty of any step or increasing the proliferation of the technology that governs any step makes things considerably easier and massively increases the pool of potential attackers. Um, so, we can think of this in terms of like if uh, the attack requires you to be a professor in a field with lots and lots of experience, then both there aren't very many people to go rogue, and there are few people to watch. So a government or other interested party can watch over the 10 professors in the world who are smart enough to do X technique pretty easily. But if the technique is cheap enough and easy enough that anyone can, pick up an undergraduate textbook, flick through it, and get to work, then it becomes a lot more difficult to keep track of. So yeah, they go through. Again, it's just a kind of uh, a good overview of some of the. This section at least is a good overview of some of the problems in synthetic biology, and then they get on to discussing uh, how AI can potentially impact these. Well, sorry, they kind of in, they alternate. So they'll discuss how. Apologize, I've only read this through once. I saw this earlier today. Um, so they discuss how problems in synthetic biology and then how AI impacts upon those. So, or might impact upon those. So, for example, we can there's some good research looking at using AI to identify strands of DNA, strings of genetic information that potentially correlate with pathogenic activity, which is wonderful as a disease surveillance mechanism because it means that we can scan a bunch of potential pathogens' DNA and predict which ones might be pathogenic. But uh, using the same algorithms, basically with just a different, learning with an inverted learning signal, or you know, simply optimizing for the opposite direction, we could get it to spit out um, genetic sequences that are particularly high probability of being pathogenic, and potentially these genetic sequences, because they might be novel, are not going to be picked up by the screening that responsible companies producing genetic constructs would do. And they bring up the potentially concerning scenario in which cloud labs are available. So labs which will do a large amount of the testing of a new genetic construct and producing of it entirely automated using artificial intelligence, which, if used maliciously, could allow a bad actor to produce entirely novel and very dangerous pathogens with in an in silico manner, as they uh, refer to it. So essentially, entirely without necessitating any access to a physical laboratory. You just interact with the AI system online, tell it what you want, and it produces the organism or the virus or whatever just as you want it. And if your intent is good, or at least if your intent and skill is good, because there's always the possibility for accidents even with good intent. But if your intent and skill are good, then hopefully that will vastly increase people's access to doing good science and reduce the burden on lab scientists because they won't need to spend as much time messing around with boring wet lab work. So that would be great. But uh, the combination of the technologies does potentially mean that the arms race in synthetic biology heats up substantially. So now we get on to the my kind of favourite, I'm admittedly very biased, but favourite bit of the paper where they discuss the cybersecurity impact, the interaction between uh, AI systems, cybersecurity, and medical devices or biological devices. So this is a good report about. It's worth looking at this if you're interested in just a brief overview of biomedical device security. Lots of both external and internal medical devices that are at a worrying level of risk from cyber attack. See, this is always a key part of mint drinks. Is you want to get the invisible mint, nice bushel of it, so it sticks in your nose as you're drinking. Mm, lovely. Right. So yeah, then they get on to discussing brain-computer interfaces, which is my jam. Uh, so they go through some of the currently available tech or the kind of emerging tech. Um, One thing I would dispute somewhat is they say brain-computer interfaces traditionally used in medicine for motor neurological disorders are AI systems that allow for direct communication between the brain and external computer. Um, so I'm not sure this is an ideal characterization of them, not least because the majority, the overwhelming majority, almost all brain-computer, at least invasive brain-computer interfaces, mainly I'm thinking here of deep brain stimulation implants and uh, cochlear implants and whatnot, um, don't use AI in the sense of like machine learning. They might use them somewhat in design, maybe, but in the near future, though, that's almost certainly going to change. Um, and there are lots of ways in which AI is going to contribute heavily to the development of brain-computer interfaces. So that's a bit of a nitpick. Um, what's their citation for that? Sorry, I'm getting into the slightly technical bullshit. Okay, that is a bit of an old review. I don't know. Anyway, so uh, no, I've gone past it. Here we go. Okay, so they mention wireless connectivity is becoming increasingly common in implantable medical devices, opening up the risk of malicious attackers mounting attacks from anywhere in the world, which is my paper. They cite, which is very nice, and I agree with their characterization of that. Um, the A lot of the existing work um, in looking at implantable medical device security has been looking at uh, the interface between the like controller and the stimulator. So if you've got a uh, let's see if I got one here. Where's it gotten to? I'm not sure where it is, but um, say I've got an implanted beneath my skin here with the wires running up beneath my scalp, beneath my skin to the brain. Uh, then I've got my controller device that communicates over short distance wirelessly with my implant. But the emerging way in which these implants are controlled is via a smartphone or similar consumer electronic device that is capable of both communicating with the implant via, say, Bluetooth and communicating with the over the internet. And this is when they say opening up the risk of malicious attackers mounting attacks from anywhere in the world. Malicious actors mounting attacks from anywhere in the world. That's what they're talking about, and it's a very real concern, or emerging real concern. Uh, J. Tibbs says he wants to buy a brain computer interface to do some deep learning. So you're talking about one of the what sort of interface are you looking at there? Are you doing a sort of EEG? I assume you're not looking at a closed loop deep brain stimulation implant or whatnot, because you probably don't want to implant that at home. I should just, sorry for the beeps and such, but I've got a new sensor starting up of my own, and I just need to calibrate it. Apologies, I'll just be a moment with this, because my own homeostatic systems don't work as they should, which is vexing, and which is why I need to hack myself. Where's my, there we go. If anybody has diabetes, I highly recommend AccuCheck Fast Click lancing device stabber thingy. It's much less painful than my old one. So I do 2 blood tests here. I'm too high. 2 blood tests here to check my glucose and calibrate my new implant. It's not really where I want to be, but at least it's not too low. That's the more imminently concerning thing. Let's see what you were looking at. Oh.
What's going on, everybody, and welcome to a video.
What's he got running?
Lots of photos. It's
Yeah, I've used
useful.
OpenBCI
The kit
before.
overall
It's
is
pretty good.
expensive. You can go down from 16 channels to 8 to save some money, or just go with the headband kit that I referenced before for 200. There's also like toys on the market with EEG, like to control cars. You can
Honestly, 16-channel EEG for $3,000 isn't bad. The stuff I was doing in my lab, we had some like pretty highly multipolar stuff, but even the like 32-channel ones are like 10 grand or more. But that's because it's very low production and you don't get economies of scale. How much fucking? But hopefully this stuff will scale up. So yeah, that's very cool. So in fairness, BCI gets used to refer to various different things, but because they're saying BCI is traditionally used in medicine for motor neurological disorders, various systems that would. Let's look up there. The citation. Oh, actually, let's not. I'm just nitpicking over a word here. It doesn't really matter. So, more importantly, right, okay, BCIs allow for bidirectional flow of information. That's something that, so previously I've seen a lot of the literature refers to BCIs primarily in the context of just recording and taking information from the nervous system to provide input for a computer. And I think that's a bit of a limited view. I much prefer, personally, brain-computer interface definition necessitating bidirectional flow, because otherwise it's not really much of a interface. It's a one-way face. Inter seems to reply to me back and forth. I don't know. Let me just have a little bit of insulin. I don't know why I pronounced it like that. Let's try. Bloody levels have been all over the place. Anyway, uh, yeah, yeah, neurofeedback or something like that if it's recording, and neurostimulation if it's stimulating. But yeah, for a proper brain-computer interface, it's kind of got to be two ways, hasn't it? Anyway, so Neuralink they mention, which is it's a fascinating product. I really wish they'd publish more, but the paper that they cite here that Neuralink has published is intriguing primate work, and potentially, if they can essentially turn that into a kind of um, USB for the brain, a universal input and output system that allows different platforms to be plugged in, then the like techno geek part of me thinks that would be super cool, and I really want to see that. The part of me that's more focused on this paper and the risk associated is somewhat concerned. So they go over some of the previous work in this area, which whenever you're discussing something like this, you've got to kind of lay out the existing stuff, um, and kind of bringing to their summary of this little area is in a future where BCI is a commonplace. Oh, and yeah. So cyber vulnerabilities in current BCIs have already been identified, including those that cause physical harm, user influence behavior. Um, these are, if we go to 45, I obviously I recommend 48, but I also particularly recommend Marcello Ienca's paper here, Hacking the Brain-Computer Interfacing Technologies and the Ethics of Neurosecurity. Ienca has written some really excellent stuff. I think that was published about the same time as my 2016 brainjacking paper, so we've been thinking about a lot of the same things. He does some very good more recent papers, and yeah, definitely worth checking out. Um, so, say in a future where BCI is commonplace alongside advanced understandings of neuroscience, it may be possible for a bad actor to achieve limited influence over the behavior of population or cause potential harm to users. And that is, I think, deeply concerning. And I completely agree that that is a risk. Um, if something bad happens, shouldn't we just expect that Neuralink will take a massive hit? Yeah, it certainly will, and this is one of the reasons to be concerned about something bad happening on a kind of smaller scale. If Neuralink has a few high-profile breaches, then the Neuralink will take a hit, but the whole field of brain-computer interfaces probably will, and there are various reasons why we would not want that to occur. Um, but there's also the possibility that nothing bad will happen, at least initially, and Neuralink and competitors become very popular, but then something really bad happens. Um, I mean, yes, I would agree that you might expect them to be going through massive lengths, but part of the problem uh, with any kind of system, any kind of widespread risk, is that uh, there's a sharing of responsibility. It's a kind of tragedy of the commons thing, where if Neuralink wins and doesn't, there's no problems, and they develop into a successful company, then they get most of the gains, or at least a substantial portion of the gains. Obviously, everyone gets gains because it's a good product, and the world benefits. But Neuralink gets a very disproportionate amount of gains from that. However, if something goes very, very bad, then because they're a limited company, and because there's only so much liability that's possible to have, they won't suffer the majority of the losses, even if it's an existential catastrophe. Um, they only suffer a small portion of the overall losses. So it's the same reason why climate change is, or one of the reasons why climate change is proving to be so politically intractable, because burning fossil fuels has a substantial benefit for oneself, but the negative externalities are diffuse across all society. So while yeah, we should expect and hope that they'll take the risk seriously, and in fairness to Elon Musk, he seems to take AI risk seriously, and I would hope that he will. I mean, I'd hope that he'll have this paper brought up to him and will take this seriously. But I don't think we should necessarily expect them to take extraordinary measures to enhance safety just on the basis of kind of economic interest. Um, and if Elon Musk has a shift in values, or just goes mad, or transfers the company to someone else, or whatnot, we can't rely on one CEO who hopefully has good beliefs on this specific topic. We can't rely on that being a continuing factor, not least because we probably shouldn't have any of these very big picture issues being decided by one person, because as I mentioned earlier, even with the best intentions, it's possible that that risk would be increased overall. Um, it might be that, for example, Musk is could be too obsessed with the idea of using brain-computer interfaces to rein in AI, when giving AI access to brain-computer interfaces is a risk all of itself. Now, I'm not saying that's that necessarily one outweighs the other. The research hasn't been done yet. I would hope to do a little bit of the research, and this is a very good framework for starting to consider how we can actually compare those risks. Um, but yeah, I think hopefully he and generally like Neuralink are responsible with this, but you've also got the fact that if there's five companies competing within this space, all competing to produce the um, most uh, uh, capable brain-computer interface, then there's a lot of incentive for one to be a bit laxer on security, get first to market, and steal the whole pie. Um, uh, Elon seems like he feels preparing for AGI is hopeless now. I I don't know what his views are. I haven't been keeping up with it very closely, but oh, bloody mouse battery. Sorry, I normally try to like charge things better and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, I would hope that he still thinks it's a serious issue, because OpenAGI is doing quite a lot of stuff in AI, and if he thinks that um, being safe about it is less of a concern, then that's not great. And again, speaks to the reasons why we probably don't want individuals with a very large proportion of control over these kind of large scale problems. Though there's also advantages to it. So anyway, we're getting getting off topic. Um, so yeah, they discuss some of the um, risks, and the fact that if brain-computer interfaces get very widely um, implemented and widely available, then the risk of an AI attack, or say an AI attack, an attack implementing AI techniques, whether that's the kind of nightmare scenario of AGI is controlling our brain, or whether it's a much more subtle thing like using AI, machine learning technology to develop um, to identify vulnerabilities in brain-computer interface systems, or to identify neurological mechanisms that could be exploited for harm. So now we get to the actual real meat of their paper, and something I very much appreciate about this paper is the fact that they have, I mean, they've got a couple of tables, but they've got one main table that is very clear. It explains what you need, and I see so many papers that include these entirely superfluous, like graphics and very complex attempts to represent data in ways that I don't want to like start bashing on anyone specific, but it's refreshing to see a paper that doesn't try to produce some absurdly convoluted method of displaying their framework. It's just straightforward, understandable table. So they plot out three scenarios in which AI and biotechnology could converge to increase risk. Um, this is all fairly self-explanatory. I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see this somewhat better. Right. So we've got different scenarios here. We've got the risk assessment framework here, broken down into probability and consequences, which, as we all know, a risk is the probability of something occurring multiplied by the consequences of it occurring. If something's high probability and high consequence, it's high risk. If it's low probability, low consequence, it's low risk. And if it's one of both but not the other, it's probably somewhere in the middle. Though in practice, a lot of the worst risks are probably of fairly low probability in kind of absolute terms, but very high consequence. And potentially each of these could have outcomes like that. So they further break down probability into the different factors that affect the likelihood of one of these things to occur, one of these outcomes to occur. So adversary, timeline, as I mentioned earlier, they do consider the timeline to be important, which I think is very much worthwhile. Democratization, so that's the kind of the level of access that people have to these technologies, the barriers of entry, are kind of inverse to the barrier of entry. So something with high democratization has low barrier to entry. Vulnerabilities, these are areas that of the topic that are particularly likely to be sort of attack surfaces. The needed expertise and skills, again speaking to the kind of the specifics of the specific areas where the barrier of entry is present, and governability, which is the ease with which governments and other policymakers can exert control over these areas. Then in consequences, we've got just the kind of magnitude of impact to all the different areas of life, and how much capability we have to sufficiently reduce the consequence of such an occurrence. You'll notice in all three circumstances we basically have none. I would agree with this. We have pretty much nothing that is sufficient to meet these threats. So just looking at brain-computer interface exploitation, because that's my main area of expertise, we've got the adversary in all three of these cases. It's a nation-state, non-state group or individual, though I note the Oxford comma is missing from this one. So let's read a lot into that. So again, I would absolutely agree that these are the three kind of potential categories that that could implement these attacks. Though, as they point out elsewhere in the paper, that's not a very, just dividing into these three groups isn't necessarily that instructive. It's a reason to look in more depth into the complexities of the different types of attackers and again, worth considering the Sandberg and Nelson paper, which looks at the kind of level of expertise and capability. And I want to do more looking at kind of the impacts of barriers to entry on adversary accessibility, because I think there's, anyway, I'll leave that aside for the moment. Um, so timeline, again, pretty self-explanatory. I would very much agree that the actual serious risk here is, at least 11 years off, possibly considerably more. It very much depends on the speed of development of the neurotechnology, and there are reasons to believe that the actual technology for interfacing with our nervous systems is likely to develop slowly because of regulatory approvals and generally the fact that there isn't as much scalability in um, uh, like neurological implants, that actual hardware you have to develop, as there is with microprocessors. Now, that's not to say it's an insurmountable challenge by any means, but uh, uh, certainly it's going to take a while to get there. But a while might be not be long. Anyway, democratization. So one thing to consider with brain computer interfaces is, as the one that Jay Tibbs was talking about earlier indicates, they're potentially not obscenely expensive if we're talking about the kind of emerging consumer grade non-invasive brain computer interfaces. The the current ones available are very, very rudimentary, but developing all the time, and with assistance from uh, machine learning based approaches, I suspect that the amount of data that we're able to get out of relatively low resolution EEG arrays is going to the amount of useful inferences we can make from that data release is going to increase substantially. Um, and then in the longer term, things like Neuralink may well bring down the invasiveness and the cost of having implanted devices by a substantial margin, which, if so, would uh, make these very widely available. Um, I'm I'm not sure how they compare with design and synthesis of pathogens, um, but certainly in terms of the barriers to entry to all of them are like worryingly low. Um, but yeah, certainly the kind of the very entry level stuff. The fact that you can buy these very basic EEG interfaces online means there's a good chance there'll be something that's very democratized. Um, vulnerabilities, yeah, I absolutely agree. Cybersecurity is the main vulnerability there, and uh, scientific expertise and skills. Again, yeah, this is I've got the first one of these three, but the areas that I've been trying to learn about while developing this are absolutely computer science and electronics. Um, so magnitude of potential consequences. I Certainly the reason why I'm interested in, or one of the reasons why I'm interested in neurotechnology, is I think the potential impact of these novel interventions, of these novel technological devices, is very substantial, and in terms of consequences to economies, if we're able to stimulate our minds and stay awake longer or function at a higher level, then that has obvious economic consequences. Being able to think of better political systems, or being more able to control our own emotional reactions or whatever, could well substantially impact politics and society. There are obvious health implications, and environment and agriculture, probably not as directly, but improving intelligence via brain-computer interfaces could certainly impact those indirectly. So yeah, overall, I would generally agree with their characterization of this area of risk, and though it's not at all a comprehensive overview, this isn't intended to be, I think it's a very good little summary that gives me a lot of interesting jumping off points for incorporating into hopefully some of my future work. Um, and yeah, I in fact highlighted this issue of time that we've already discussed. Um, so yeah, I was very pleased to read this, and I think it's a very worthwhile addition to the field. Um, and I'm excited uh, to write about it in the future. Um, oh, we've just got a raid. Hello. Excellent. Hello, it's lovely to have you, Geek with Glasses. Thank you very much for hitting me with a raid. I've just finished discussing a recent paper about risk assessment in artificial intelligence and biology, which was rather interesting. I've spilled my drink a little bit. It's fine. If anyone is interested in going back and watching that, I would. Um, yeah, just returned the Raiders just finishing up. Though I'll stick around for a little while longer uh, and discuss maybe a bit of politics or something. Um, but yeah, so I would for people just arriving. Hi, I'm Laurie, post-normal. I do science and kind of a bit of like tech and ethics and whatnot. I'm particularly interested in the future, and thank you very much to Geek with Glasses for paying back the raid. I'm rather enjoying our raiding back and forth here. Very kind of you. So yeah. I also, in addition to science, technology, and so forth, I like cocktails. Sometimes ones with a mint garnish don't go particularly well with green screen, but we live and learn. And so I'm currently enjoying a mint julep. Um, mm, although there we go. Sometimes you get a bit of mint clogging up the straw. Um, so let's have a quick look at the news. Because it is, as always, we are in this weird accelerating spiral of nonsense. Um, okay, so we're giving up on the prosecution of Michael Flynn, apparently, which doesn't seem great. Uh, Here we go, politicization inside Barr's Justice Department. I cannot say I'm surprised to hear that there is a little bit of uh, political influence inside Barr's Justice Department. That's not exactly a huge shocker. Um, Stanley K. Gly says maybe you can pull me away from libertarianism, or I can get you back into good, clean libertarian ethics. Um, I mean, maybe I should maybe I should adopt them, but hopefully, hopefully one of us will change the other's mind, because one of us is probably closer to the truth than the other, and it's a good thing to be, drawn close to the truth. Right, let's listen to this.
Scott, that's right. This is reporting from NBC News' Jeff Bennett, who is reporting now that there's a new plan at the White House for how to deal with coronavirus testing At the federal level in states across the country, Jeff Bennett reporting that the Trump administration is planning to end its funding and support for coronavirus testing sites at the end of this month. That is on June 30th. The administration is billing this as an effort to broaden community testing, put more emphasis on public-private partnerships such as pharmacies, CVS, Rite Aid, and facilities like that.
So
The Trump administration initially planned to transition what's called the
this,
community-based
I
testing
did see
sites.
this earlier, and this reminds me of so Trump's argument here. Um, let's try steel manning his position. So his position is that by testing, we are increasing the number of identified cases, and having more identified cases is bad because it looks bad politically, which it kind of does look bad politically for him. So let's stop testing. Now, this seems like pretty much the archetypal example, indeed perhaps a textbook example of Goodhart's law. This is an adage. Yeah, it is very hard to steel man that because it's unless you're working from an assumption that the only thing that matters is Trump's political popularity, which, I mean, to be fair to Trump, he probably is. Uh, but unless you're working from that assumption, it doesn't really work. So yeah, Goodhart's law is the idea that when you let a measure become the goal, then it ceases to become a good measure. So let's say I want to improve education and I make the score on X test, a standardized test, be the measure of how well education is going. Well, then everybody is likely to start using that increasing test scores or increasing this standardized test score as the goal of their efforts. And if this occurs, then it's not a good measure anymore because you're measuring how good people are for optimizing this one standardized test score. So yeah, exactly what's happened in education. Now, normally this is an accidental process. This is the sort of thing that happens when some idiot policymaker doesn't fully consider the implication of the metric that they're selecting, or they select a unrepresentative metric, or they just select one or whatever, and it leads to bad consequences. Trump, brilliantly, uniquely, is doing this explicitly. So instead of using it as a logical bias in thought, instead of using it as an accidental mistake, he's using it as a deliberate and blatant strategy in order to what? Because if he's telling everyone about it, it doesn't achieve the like you say the quiet he's saying the quiet part out loud. He's saying that we should fuck up this metric, we should make it a terrible metric and not record what it's actually supposed to be recording because it looks bad. And normally when politicians do that, they go through all of the boring, fusty old hassle of concealing that they're doing something really bad and stupid for a political purpose. But not Trump. No, no, no. The brave president of the United States is willing to shed aside those petty concerns of like maintaining a veneer of competency or a veneer of caring for anything beyond his short-term political success, and boldly and radically in a way that only he can, it's just diving straight into utter stupidity. Um, so like of all of the things, even if one is like a hyper libertarian, as I used to be, pretty much everyone agrees that there's some level of like national defense or like protection of society that needs to take place, unless you're an actual anarchist. In which case, fine. I've been an anarchist in my time. No, not throwing any shade. But unless you're willing to get rid of all government, then we've kind of got to accept there's got to be some protection of society. from outside forces or whatever. And I think one can make a pretty strong argument that that should include biodefense. We might not want to provide a kind of standing healthcare service if we think that's too expensive or infringes on people's freedom or whatever. I think there's a good argument to be made for single payer healthcare service, but we might not want to. Okay, fair enough. But when it comes to a pandemic, uh, coming into the country and ripping through the population, that seems like a pretty basic national security concern. And here, Trump is just disarming. Imagine if the response to geopolitical threats from Iran was just to like take all the missiles and disable them and throw them into the ocean and like blow up one of the supercarriers and then be like, haha, Iran's not threatening our carrier strike group anymore. It's like, well, I suppose. Iran can't launch any missiles at the carrier strike group because it's on the bottom of the ocean, but you haven't really like improved the geostrategic position at all, have you? So it's just this utter it's the combination of his disrespect for experts, of his lack of any kind of subject level expertise, of his bizarre management style. I mean, you can see why he failed so often at business. And I'm not one of these people who's like, he had a bankruptcy. Obviously, a lot of businesses go bankrupt. That's not necessarily, uh, uh, the fault of the owners or whatnot. But when he's engaged in so much shitty business, like the whole casino debacle in Atlantic City was just, where was it, Atlantic City? Wherever he had a casino, the Trump Taj Mahal casino, it was just hilarious and so sloppily managed, and yet again indicative of the fact that pretty much everything he touches is massively tied up with organized crime and with people who are, if not organized criminals themselves, then basically they're at least maybe one step away, if that. Um, and it's just this insane, poorly managed clusterfuck. And on the one hand, there's at least the fact that he is incompetent enough that he's, I don't want to say probably, hopefully going to be voted out this coming election cycle. Um, Fingers crossed, enough moderate Republicans and if those still exist and uh, uh, whatnot want to get rid of him. The suburban voters who went Obama Trump in 2016. Hopefully enough of those will see his ranking competence and get rid of him. But my real concern is that, well, one of my concerns is that he'll somehow win, possibly as a result of the fact that the electoral system is very much packed against Democrats currently. But also, my big concern is that there's going to be another Trump, except this time competent. Someone who can do enough of the dog whistling uh, and hinting at far right agenda to get the Nazis all slathering, while still maintaining enough respectability and enough like perception of capability that the whole, I'm going to be a great businessman and improve the economy thing actually sounds plausible to more people beyond, the base of 15 to 30% or whatever it is of people who, and yeah, I think Geek with Glasses, you're absolutely correct. Tom Cotton is potentially that man, and that concerns me, especially as he went full mask off in the New York Times. Um, Fuck the New York Times, by the way, of the Scott Alexander thing. If you haven't been following, it's a pile of shit. Just look into it. New York Times being shitty, but see, Stanley Kekelai, you say, and lefties want someone like this to be in charge of our healthcare every 4 to 8 years, and I think, though I'm not sure it applies particularly strongly, specifically in the case of healthcare, I think there is a very reasonable point there, and one that I still think is a powerful part of the kind of the overall libertarian critique of sort of liberal democracy, or at least standard current kind of liberal democracy, is that there are a lot of functions that we might want government to do if it did them well, but giving government control of it means you also have the bad guys taking control of it. And I'm particularly concerned about this in the context of surveillance and a lot of intelligence apparatus. I think there's a lot of tools that it would be great if investigators had and could use sensibly, um, but they have such a potential for abuse that whatever side of the political aisle you're on, you should probably be concerned about your political opponents having access to them. Um, and there are probably some areas where we want to accept a less than optimally efficient government because the potential consequences, the risk associated with bad actors getting their hands on certain functions of government are so high that they overall bring the expected value of government down. Um, and yeah, this is an argument I've been making for a while, and I think uh, it's a very valid critique, and Trump has absolutely highlighted it very, very strongly. Um, and yeah, similarly, uh, well, I actually don't know as much about UK politics. My knowledge of politics is weirdly focused. I've taken this interest in US politics to a much greater degree than UK politics. But yeah, certainly, I think that so there's an argument to be made for kind of federalism here, in the sense that, um, say, California has a lot of social programs that seem to work well within California. Well, no, sorry, social programs are a bad example. Seems to have a lot of regulatory options that um, seem to work well for California, disregarding the like everything causes cancer bullshit labels and whatnot. But some of the standards seem to work well, but probably wouldn't be quite as good if rolled out on a national level, because you'd end up with more regulatory capture by by lobbyists and by the Republican Party. Um, and yeah, the currently politically, I'm somewhere between like social libertarian and just boring liberal and like neoliberal and like social democrat, and like somewhere in that general kind of melange, depending on what area of policy we're talking about. But I think that there probably is a bit of kind of relativism between countries in terms of policy, not necessarily in terms of moral relativism. Uh, I'm honestly not sure exactly where I stand on. Um, I wouldn't say I wouldn't call myself a moral relativist, but I think that it does have some useful considerations, at least for certain aspects of moral judgment. But anyway, even disregarding that, there do seem to be some practical constraints on policy that are put in place by the locality that it's acting on, and this seems to be imposed by things like culture, population size, um, by like geography, a whole bunch of factors. And I think it's plausible, at least, that something like the Nordic model of social democracy works well there, but might not work as well in other countries that have quite substantially different kind of cultural norms in certain areas, or have different like population sizes. The task of running a functioning, very broad welfare state in uh, Norway or Sweden is substantially different to doing it in even like Germany or the UK, let alone the US. Um, yeah. Social libertarians. My understanding is it's pretty libertarian among most areas, but supportive of welfare state. I'd say I probably support some like regulations that a strict social libertarian wouldn't. Uh, but I think that at least some minimal level of welfare state is pretty necessary uh, to achieve overall good outcomes. And personally, I think universal basic income is pretty attractive, or negative income tax. They're my understanding is they're like mathematically the same, but framing and like communication of policies matters. And I think universal basic income is easier to communicate, but negative income tax is probably easier to like frame as not being a cash handout to rich people, when obviously if you're taxing, then yeah, environmental, financial regulation, that kind of thing. I don't know nearly as much about financial regulation, but certainly there's a bunch of market failures and tragedies of the commons where I think that someone needs to step in and regulate, whether that's a like standard organization that everyone can kind of agree on. I love the ISO, by the way, International Standards Organization, um, or whether it's government. Often there needs to be some form of regulation, and in a lot of instances, uh, it's the only practical actor to implement that legislation, that regulation, at least at the moment, is a governmental body. Um, when's your ISO stream? At some point, I need to do a stream on ISO, particularly ISO 8601, which is the standard way of showing time formats. Now, I'm not going to do it now, but ISO 8601 is the one that goes um, uh, year, month, day, or year, month, date. Uh, and it's clearly the most logical system for um, reporting the. Oh shit! My blood glucose is dropping. Whoa. Okay, that's. Um, oh, it's probably my new sensor. Let me just do a test. One of the um, uh, one of the problems with new sensors is they don't measure very accurately until it's been through like a day or so of calibration. For those who are new, I have a blood glucose sensor in my arm that communicates wirelessly with my phone and occasionally buzzes at me to tell me that I need to take sugar or insulin, as the case may be. Um, and it's just notified me that I might be about to go unconscious, but I'm probably not, because it's probably over exaggerating the degree of change. Um, but yes, I agree that there should be some form of. Yeah, it's 6.9. Nice. No, you're not picking up on that. 6.9. I'm always pleased when it's 6.9 because it's the sex number. But yeah, that's fine. Okay, I need to override calibration. 6.9. Okay, yeah. So as I expected, my blood glucose is going down at a reasonable rate. Um, uh, so going back a couple of messages. So yes, first of all, Neon Golden is my fiance, and unironically, the most tense debate we've had in years was recently over um, whether the week begins on a Sunday or Monday. I was used to it beginning on a Sunday, but ISO 8601 says Monday, and I standardize wherever possible on ISO. So Amy won that, Neon Golden won that debate, and I have since changed the date settings and whatnot for my. Um, so you'll see my week now begins on Monday. Um, uh, Sony Kick Lie, like to prevent 2008, yeah, basically like there's a lot of things that it seems the government can do that probably the companies can do that we probably want the government interfering with, lest it cause systemic effects. Like at the most basic level, we probably don't want companies producing large amounts of like weapons grade plutonium or uranium, and we probably don't want them selling like over the counter smallpox pills that just give you smallpox. Um, it's we can argue where the level is, but there's got to be some level of regulation. Um, and does manual blood sugar regulation regulate your mood at all? Yeah, it does in some ways. It's one of the most annoying things about diabetes is generally I find the mood is kind of secondary to the effects on my like energy levels. Um, there's also the fact that it can be a bit frustrating, having um, notifications buzz up every half hour telling me I've got to take sugar or take insulin or watch out you're going to die or but it's much more automatic than historically a lot of diabetics had to deal with like all kinds of shitty frustrating manual testing and yeah, it can be frustrating at times, and certainly when my blood glucose goes too high or too low, if it stays too high for an extended period of time, it has just gone quite high, but not like ridiculously so, and I intervened quickly, so it's going to be all right. If it stays high for more than like an hour or two, I start getting quite bad headaches. I get very dehydrated and start feeling quite like run down and uh, unenergetic. But if it goes too low, my cells just aren't getting enough. Specifically, my brain tissue isn't getting enough glucose and starts very literally on a cellular level running out of energy, which isn't ideal. So fortunately, though, with the help of a sensor embedded in my arm, I'm able to tell what the level is at and intervene accordingly. So it provides one part of my of the homeostatic loop, um, and the other portion is currently provided by me using a insulin pen that I stab in myself and inject. But hopefully, eventually, will involve an automated system that will tie in. Thank you very much, Geek with Glasses. You have a good evening. Well, no, afternoon for you. Um, but really appreciate the raid. You stay cool, dude, and I'll see you around. Um, so lots of people were shitting on libertarians because of the pandemic. They probably want pandemic preparedness. Yeah, I would hope that libertarians would, and indeed, it was Obama who implemented a task force within the National Security Council that was dedicated to pandemic preparedness. Um, and appropriately enough, within the national security framework, I think there's strong argument to be made that there's way more threat to U.S. interests and the interests of pretty much every nation from natural pandemics than from most forms of terrorism, with the exclusion of weapons of mass destruction. Um, I think they should be putting way more resources into guarding against biological risks. And so, and you don't need a full healthcare system to do with this. Excuse me. Um, and yeah, the task force was like negligible in terms of budget. Um, and a lot of this is extremely low cost but extremely high gain, uh, uh, like work policy. And it's the sort of stuff that, as a when I was a libertarian, I would constantly say, okay, I don't like government, but there are some things it does that are very high impact, and before we, remove them from government, before we remove funding from them, we should have some system in place for replacing that. This back when I was kind of an anarchist, I was still an incrementalist. Incidentally, shout out to Scuff Dario, who is currently an incrementalist anarchist, and I'd love to have more of a chat about that with him, because he's an interesting chap, and is very good at being a kind of a reasonable anarchist, saying ultimately I want government gone, but how do we get there, and how can we get there from the current system and without, going mad about the whole thing. So, you know, there's definitely some things the government does, including pandemic preparedness, that is pretty cheap. By the standards of, certainly by the standards of national defence spending, or by the standards of a universal healthcare system, or pensions. Any of these very big. Obviously, I know, money goes in the pension pot theoretically, but pensions is basically just a Ponzi scheme. But anyway, so by any of these metrics, uh, there's a lot of spending going on that, like, per dollar, isn't really achieving very much. I don't want to say it's like completely worthless, but um, in the case of uh, averting global pandemics, we're talking about an expenditure of hundreds of millions, maybe a few billions a year, for a huge amount of gain. And this was, I'm not saying that COVID-19 wouldn't have occurred had the pandemic preparedness, or global health security, I think it was called, committee on the National Security Council hadn't been disbanded. But it probably would have been managed a lot better. And one of the things that team was working on is not just uh, preventing pandemics spreading within the US, but engaging with nations abroad, other nations, and um, engaging with local healthcare responses in order to prevent the initial spread of a pandemic. Because, like, analogous to the war on terror, if you want to deal with terrorism, sometimes you might want to go and target the people abroad so they don't hit your country, which in the case of the war on terror is very, very expensive and has a bunch of negative externalities. But might be a more effective way of dealing with terrorists than waiting for them to come to the shores of one's country. Um, but in the case of diseases, there's not really anybody around getting pissed off that you're dropping vaccines on them, in the same way as they are, understandably, when you drop bombs on them. So, if anything, there's a better argument to be made than in the war on terror to be made for global health security, where you are preventing these diseases occurring in the locations where they arise. And this is something the Obama administration did very well in the case of Ebola, in West Africa, by shutting down the outbreak quickly in its originating location. There was very, very little case transfer um, over to the US itself. Um, so Stanley K. Cly is excited to understand what pushed me towards neoliberalism. Um, so I'd say one of the fundamental things, and I want to do a proper stream about this at some point, about why I'm no longer a libertarian. Um, I think there was several factors. So first of all, my views on ethics changed somewhat. I now give less weight to deontological arguments than I did previously, and I think, at least for the kind of libertarian anarchism that I was previously interested in, it does rely, at least somewhat heavily, I think, on at least implementing the near term, um, on uh, uh, um, uh, yeah, on, like, deontological justification for one's beliefs. So asserting that it is a fundamental wrong to aggress against another person using this specific definition of aggression, then one should not do it in any circumstances, and one is justified in fighting against anyone who does. And while that is a very compelling framework, or at least was to me previously, uh, I'm more convinced now, largely through reading work on utilitarianism, that a more dominant part of my philosophy, my ethical framework, should be consequentialist in outlook. So, with that in mind, I've gone back and examined fucking thing. I don't know what's up with this. I think if it doesn't have sound playing through it or something for a while, it. Anyway, um, so I've gone back and examined a lot of my policy positions, where previously I would have just kind of substituted the default libertarian view, because when you've got an ideological system that's compelling and that you think has a large portion of the answers, then it's quite easy to kind of default to, well, I agree with libertarianism or whatever on issues A, B, and C, so I'll probably agree with them on X, Y, and Z, even though that doesn't necessarily follow. Um, so one of the things that brought me to libertarianism in the first place is that I agreed with its quite radical stance on the war on drugs. Since I was, I don't know, 13 or something, I've been very much opposed to the war on drugs, on the basis of various lines of evidence, both um, empirical evidence for relative harms and a wide variety of philosophical arguments. I think the war on drugs can be argued against using quite a wide range of philosophical arguments, but there wasn't a lot of people, a lot of like political organizations that were sharing that view. So libertarianism was pretty much the only one at the time that was kind of uh, widely discussing this, maybe outside of some areas of extreme sort of lefty thought that I didn't happen to interact with. Um, and also shared my views on sort of freedom of speech and freedom of expression, which and then went on to shape them more. And so as I kind of decoupled individual policy prescriptions that I favour from ideology, I began questioning more a lot of the kind of economic doctrine of libertarianism, which I um, wasn't as well. I'm just not an economist, so I used to make a fair number of economic arguments that were kind of the default, libertarian economic argument, which I probably shouldn't have been because I just wasn't expert enough in economics to be making that. I was kind of parroting, talking points. Um, so as I went back and looked over these, either I reached the conclusion that I just don't know enough and should probably stop commenting about areas, or um, it seemed to be the case that in some areas market solutions are superior, in some areas they're not as obviously superior. Um, so yeah, I think absolutely, um, like rule consequentialism, rule utilitarianism can get you in the direction of libertarianism. Um, I just don't think it can get you all the way to the most extreme instantiations of it. Um, and B, I think that so all of the things you mentioned there are good because they have um, instrumental value. We care about, if you're a consequentialist, you care about freedom of expression because it provides for good outcomes, it improves people's lives, it has on net positive benefits, etc. But whereas most libertarians will be quite sort of doctrinaire about that, not necessarily those who are approaching it from a predominantly consequentialist perspective, but whereas it's tempting to kind of be quite doctrinaire and say, okay, so we should prioritize free speech in all circumstances. Um, I think a more sensible interpretation of that, a more defensible interpretation within libertarianism would be freedom of speech, freedom of expression is very, very good. There's lots of instances that we can point to where restricting it is bad. So we should generally work on the assumption that we should follow that we should promote freedom of expression. However, we should recognise that there are potential circumstances where it's a bad thing. So to provide a relevant example to earlier, um, I don't think people should be allowed, whether through government force or whatever. I think there should be some mechanism for preventing people publishing the uh, a like the entire smallpox genome um, with modifications that would make it more dangerous, something like that. I think it would be entirely reasonable, even though that is undoubtedly a method of expression. Um, I think there's undoubtedly there should be some kind of mechanism for stopping people doing that. So yeah, I think so. I would agree that pure consequentialism, or at least a kind of naive view of consequentialism can certainly make people appear too short-sighted. And I think there is so I think there is a lot of value to trying to maintain principles when we think that they have generally good effects. Um, but I don't think we have enough data or enough evidence to understand what any of these things, with the effects of any of these principles, have in the long run. We haven't had freedom of expression for more than a few hundred years. We haven't had, you know, um, globalization, which is something that I think is a pretty unalloyed good. Then there are some negative consequences, of course, but no, not at all. Don't worry. Uh, so I think that um, we should at least have a lot of humility when it comes to our prescriptions for what freedoms we should maintain as inviolable and which ones we should um, potentially be flexible on. There are certainly chasing these freedoms as an end in and of themselves is liable to have some negative consequences. Now, you might argue that they are so universally useful that though we might not want to chase them as an end in of themselves, we should act in a very close manner to that because the situations where they are bad are so outweighed by the situations that they're good, or that the value to kind of establishing that norm to avert future harms is very valuable. And I again I find this compelling, and I'm certainly often on that side of the argument. If I'm talking with a social democrat, often I will, be the one to point out that maybe we shouldn't be giving up all of these principles, all of these norms, and shouldn't be intervening in specific ways, even if we think that the short-term outcomes would be good. We've got to recognise that there may well be unintended consequences, and that these unintended consequences can be very bad. So certainly, I take your points, and I think that they're things that are definitely worth considering. However, um, if we so if like I don't want to mischaracterize you because obviously you're just typing fairly short pieces here, but like if we look at uh, say avoiding authoritarianism is good. That is something I can very strongly agree with as a general rule. But there are circumstances that we can probably imagine where some form of authoritarianism is a preferable outcome than to some even worse outcome. So let's say, for example, that there's an asteroid heading to crash into the planet, and world governments just end up squabbling over what to do. Nobody actually gets anything done. it may be necessary to implement some kind of authoritarian system to get everyone to coordinate and produce means of deflecting the asteroid. Um, and if that is I'm not saying this is necessarily a plausible example, but if that is the only way of overcoming the asteroid, we should probably give up that principle at least for a time being, because otherwise we all die. Um, so I guess what I'm saying is that there are exceptions, and it seems to me that there are enough exceptions that are less extreme than that we should view these principles as very good heuristics, and ones that we probably shouldn't deviate from without good reason. But there are, I think, good reasons to deviate from them um, in plenty of instances. Um, and this actually reminds me of I've been rereading Garrett M. Graff's Raven Rock recently, just because it's a really interesting book, and it talks a lot about continuity of government planning, and it kind of I guess goes over the COG plans, continuity of government plans, that the US government had during the Cold War, um, that if nuclear war had broken out, then basically the constitution would have been suspended, and a pretty authoritarian regime would have been put in place temporarily in order to bring society back from a state of utter emergency. Now, it was a pretty shoddy plan. It was drawn up in secret. It was not very well considered. Well, it was very deeply considered in many ways. It's just it was trying to address an extremely big problem. And I'm not entirely convinced that uh, authoritarianism actually would have been the best kind of outcome there. If there were widespread nuclear war in the US, maybe we don't want the constitution suspended, or maybe we at least want a constitutional amendment so that there is a constitutional mechanism for a temporary takeover of government that doesn't result in spiraling into a long-term dictatorship. Um, but so more generally, I guess there are some circumstances where authoritarianism, in the broader sense, seems necessary. Um, so, like if you're, say, a military unit, uh, we probably don't want a fighting force made up of platoons of soldiers who all get to vote on what course of action to engage in next. You probably want one person who has like definite command over a given unit, who is able to give orders in a structured manner. And that's a authoritarian system. There's no democracy taking place there. Um, so outside of the sphere of kind of national politics, and we can think of other examples of like corporations that are made effective by relatively like authoritarian practices. Um, there seem to be some instances where, like, in order to coordinate effectively in high stress, high um, very dynamic situations, you probably need one agent like exerting authority over other agents within a organization. On a governmental level, authoritarianism has massively failed time and again over the long term and has caused huge harms. So yeah, I would certainly, you know, hope that there are better alternatives to authoritarianism in just about every situation. Um, but I think if we can conceive of circumstances where we might want to give in to authoritarianism, at least temporarily, in order to avoid worse harms. Like, I think that's the most obvious of your four um, kind of examples there. Uh, that avoiding authoritarianism is good as something that everyone except for like tankies and fascists can agree on, and fuck tankies and fascists. So like things like freedom of expression drives most people happiness and innovation. That's more debatable, and I think we can probably provide um, more examples of where uh, freedom of expression doesn't always drive most people's happiness and innovation. So, so again, yeah, I agree with like the general form of each of those points, and it's the reason why I'm still in the general area of libertarian. I'm still certainly like, you know, in the political compass, I'm still certainly like bottom half, and very amenable to market solutions, and I think they're preferable where possible. And generally we should avoid um, aggressing on individual citizens as much as we can. Uh, I just think that they are useful, instrumental um, uh, concerns rather than ends in and of themselves. Um, but yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to like tear them apart in detail. I realised that you'd uh, pose them as sort of general examples. Um, and J Tibbs, you talking about authoritarianism being worse, or coordination problems being worse? Because in both instances, I would probably agree with you. I think you know, just to be clear through all this, I'm certainly not advocating for uh, authoritarianism on any kind of uh, like national political level, um, and I'm very much opposed to authoritarian systems of government. I just think that we probably shouldn't be. I guess I think that ideology is uh, limited and generally a bad way of deciding um, what policies we should implement. Uh, and libertarianism often comes across to me as an ideology that happens to line up with a lot of my policy preferences rather than um, a uh, an ideology that I would fully subscribe to anymore. Um, though I'd still, if someone calls me libertarian leaning, I'd probably accept that. Or libertarian, or something like that. But yeah. So yeah, JTIPS, I certainly agree that authoritarianism can get a lot worse with tech. I don't know if anyone's seen. So everyone knows about China's social credit system, which is, ugh. Um, but there's also increasingly they're using brain-computer interfaces, well, specifically neurofeedback EEG recording, to monitor the attention and the sort of very basic aspects of the brain states of workers in some factories in order to check for um, focus and distraction and all that sort of thing, which not not good. Um, Accessing neurological information as a means of controlling people, I'm very, very concerned about the prospect of. Even leaving aside the cybersecurity concerns, the implications of a government or corporations or anyone getting uh, assumed access to the contents, the physiological underlyings of the contents of your own head. I think there's strong reason, even just sort of prima facie, to be opposed to that. And well, hopefully in my forthcoming paper I will dive into that a little bit more. But uh, yeah, that's kind of thing that sometimes makes me want to run back to libertarianism and go, yeah, burn down the government in a video game. Um, but like expectations. But if we weight what's likely and expected value on both sides, somewhat libertarian rules with count on top. Yeah, I would agree. Like I think that um, in terms of economics, we should generally prefer market solutions where possible. All else being equal, it's probably preferable that the government isn't given control over a sector of the economy because that tends to, or at least that introduces the risk of greater control and greater grabbing and extending of government functions over other aspects of the economy. So it's reasonable to kind of prefer, all else being equal, market solutions. I think there are some instances, this is where I diverge from most libertarians, is that there's quite a few instances where market failures occur to the degree that it is worth the risk of the government having control over an industry or an area of the economy in order to get much greater efficiency gains. So, say like fire services, it's far more efficient for the government, some form of government, whether it's local government, whatever, to be running fire services. We just have to look at the history of shitty competitive fire departments back in major cities in the 19th century to know that. And while potentially the government having control over fire services means that they could blackmail people with fire protection, or they could refuse to put out fires of political rivals, or any of these things. I think we should probably generally agree that the fire service is something that the government should be controlling, just because the market failure is so massive if uh, if it's left up purely to private enterprise. Um, or at very least, there needs to be heavy regulation uh, over fire services so that we don't get some of these very bad market failures. Um, so yeah, I and similarly when it comes to kind of political freedoms, um, on some issues I'm still quite radical. For example, when it comes to sort of social issues, I am very much in favour of radical morphological freedom. Would go far beyond trans rights to transgender people's rights to support trans species or whatever kind of rights. Um, so there are some areas where I'm fairly extreme small L libertarian, um, but I would say less doctrinaire about free speech than I used to be. Anyway, I was supposed to do a whole episode on this. I'm planning on actually, thinking about this properly before just answering. Though yeah, I think as a general rule, uh, the libertarians have a lot of good stuff at least. Um, and I mean, really, I think there's less in terms of the big issues, the stuff that really actually matters. I think there's less uh, like difference between actual liberals and libertarians than um, than a lot of people seem to think. Um,
A
what's
commissioners
this?
meeting in
Oh,
Florida's Palm Beach County, anger erupted after a unanimous vote to make masks mandatory. This turned downright ugly. Here was the scene.
You literally cannot mandate somebody to wear a mask knowing that that mask is killing people. It literally is killing people. And the people are waking up, and we know what citizen's arrest is, because citizen's arrests are already happening, okay? And every single one of you that are obeying the devil's laws
the
are going to
devil's
be
laws.
arrested. And you, doctor, are going to be arrested for crimes against humanity.
The problem with humanity today is ignorance, arrogance, and apathy. Keep taking the road of least resistance. Keep listening to the TV brainwashing you from birth.
And they want to throw God's
wonderful breathing system out the door. You're all turning your backs on it.
Sir, I really have
You're
many
turning your
questions
back on
about
the
your
lungs that God
degrees and
gave
what
you.
you really know. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't think that you are worthy of your credentials.
The-
And I would ask
These
suggestively
are
that you
people
go back
wearing
to school
like
and get educated.
cotton poly blends and who presumably drove to this place. It's so weird where some people, what areas of technology some people will use, and what areas some people think are, the devil's work, interfering with God's perfect lungs or whatever the fuck. Um, that's, I mean, well done, America. You've just fucking, oh dear. Steig, by transspecies, do you mean otherkin? Yeah, like otherkin or like furries or people who just want to like spend 6 months being a whale or whatever. So I'm coming from a pretty like libertarian transhumanist background, but like if people want to modify the way that their bodies are formed, and we have the technology to enable them to do that, and they think it's going to improve their quality of life for whatever reason, it's fine. Just let them. Um, I don't see. I know they are. I don't understand why. Um, just just let people have their bodies. Um, you're confused about what they mean with "I want to be X," then go ask one of them nicely. Like, don't be an ass about it. But I don't claim to know. I'm not. Uh, uh, I'm not myself at all of that persuasion. But like, just if they claim to want to be a fox or a deer or a mouse or whatever, just ask them what they mean. There's a good chance that some of them will mean different things to others. There might be many motivations for wanting to be an animal. They may mean many different things about what they want to achieve. Whether they want to, in some way, have the consciousness of that animal. How we would engineer that is an interesting question, but it's not. Some of the aspects of the conscious experience may well be potentially available. Whether it's the physical form, whether it's certain aspects, whether they just like want the ears or the tail or whatever. Um, like, at worst, it's not your cup of tea, and that's fine. If you don't want to uh, have your body modified in a certain way, if you don't want to act in a certain way, then don't. Um, are there any lines we shouldn't cross, though? Yeah, those that cause extreme suffering or very widespread suffering. Um, like I think there are probably some areas that we should be that we should be reticent to, or reluctant, not too hasty to interfere with, particularly those that involve very widespread, irreversible changes of our biology. So germline editing, I'm not saying stop it, but we should be cautious about, uh, say, very deep, irreversible editing of our consciousness. We should probably be at least somewhat reluctant to do, so somewhat careful with. But when it comes to modifying one's body to be more like an animal or more like whatever else one wants, then yeah, it should be discussed with a physician, and it should be done in a responsible manner in order to reduce the risk of negative outcomes, including death or suicide, whatever. Um, but the way to do that is to discuss it and let people access medical care and psychologists who are willing to talk with them non-judgmentally and so forth, not like berate them off the internet. Not suggesting that any of my viewers would do this. I know you are all lovely people with excellent taste and whatnot, but yeah, it seems to be a very common thing on the internet that furries and otherkin and all of these people are at best subject to bemusement and at worst subject to quite severe harassment, because they want to live their lives more like a rabbit or something. Um, and uh, when you do the politics stream, could you address why people would be pro-welfare over foreign aid? Because that video pushed me even further from wanting to privilege Americans. Um, I I would have to think a while to formulate those arguments cogently because I don't think they're very good. I think that we should have ideally, I think we should have some kind of global welfare state, and that it would would massively improve the quality of life of very globally poor people and improve it somewhat for people who are poor in the developed world. Of course, while resources are practically speaking locked within the boundaries of nation states, uh, then obviously welfare is an achievable system, whereas unfortunately radical increase in foreign aid isn't. Um, but yeah, like um, if I could, if I could like wave my magic wand and implement some kind of whether it's heavily federalized or like UN controlled or whatever uh, global system whereby the world's very poorest are getting an adequate level of aid. I say adequate, still, bring them up to be like globally poor as opposed to extremely poor, or maybe middle income, which is still poor by uh, the standards of the US and America and so forth. Um, but that would achieve a lot more good than current welfare states. And but you can make the argument. So to steelman the position a bit, one can certainly make the argument that there's some level of a club at play. By being a member of uh, being a member of a country, you have paid into the pot and you have some expectation of getting money back. I think that kind of breaks down in a few places, but yeah, well, good job on the tithe. I would certainly encourage the rules is. I would certainly encourage you to keep up the tithe. Rules is not dumb, but incomplete, I think. Um, now this is an interesting question. Expert Node 008. Don't you think that giving foreign aid to poor authoritarian nations won't just reinforce the regime power, allowing them to stay in power for longer, resulting in lower long-term quality of life for the residents in those countries? That is a very important point, and it's the reason why we should certainly be careful about giving out foreign aid directly to regimes, and especially giving it in order to like buy back military weapon systems. Um, However, in practice, USAID and the Department for International Development in the UK don't just give money directly to the governments like blindly. Um, while some of the funds do inevitably get uh, do inevitably get used for inappropriate purposes, high quality aid is targeted at specific interventions in specific areas. So you will have money going to, say, the government's health department, along with some auditors who will go in and check that it's actually going to healthcare resources. And you'll have international research collaborators going in who are studying the consequences of that aid. So you end up with a system where there are checks and balances, and in some instances you're just giving the resources directly to the recipients, or pretty directly. In some instances, you're paying for lots of outside medical workers to come in and administer specialist aid, or to come in and train locals to administer that aid. And in basically all of the like really high impact interventions, you're giving it to someone who's almost certainly going to use it in an appropriate manner, and you're carefully monitoring afterwards to make sure that it's not being used badly. So it's actually, there's a see if I can find it, because this is something that comes up often, and it's really um, worth considering. But uh, let's see if I can find that. Not the Oxfam one, because Oxfam isn't. Here we go. So I would highly recommend this article that covers this and a few other um, uh, sort of topics in this area. So is it, aid is useless due to corruption. Um, so okay, this isn't a very uh, detailed explanation of that point, but it's certainly something we need to be mindful of, and it's one of the reasons why um, other international aid organisations should really pay attention um, to the impacts that have been achieved by DFID, the Department for International Development in the UK, which has had a lot of massive success at overcoming neglected tropical diseases and engaging in worthwhile development work. Unfortunately, it's probably going to get fucked over because Boris Johnson is remerging it with the Foreign Department. That's not going. It's going to be some bullshit. But the uh, uh, the upshot is that a lot of good has been done with those programs, and they can be a really useful template for um, foreign for non-UK aid organisations to achieve a lot of impact with governmental aid. I haven't seen Tyler Cowen and Peter Singer's debate, but that seems very relevant to my interests, since Tyler Cowen's an interesting chap, and Peter Singer is quite delightful. Let's see, I will. Is this the? Let's see a few transcripts here, so I'll read one of those later. Um, but yes, indeed, thank you for the recommendation. Uh, and and yeah, I shall check that out later. I just need to get some Coke, not the not the alkaloid type. Well, I suppose Coca-Cola does have caffeine in it, which is an alkaloid, but not as heavily dopaminergic as cocaine. But yeah, I agree. Systematic change, systemic change is something that EA could address substantially more, and it's something that um, uh, it's one of those traffic light problems where, because it's easier to study things that we can quantify. Ah, sorry, just getting some ice, because even when my blood glucose is dropping, I need to enjoy a civilized drink. Um, so yeah, it's definitely reasonable to want EA to avoid that kind of traffic light effect where, because we can only quantify some things, it's tempting to only intervene there, even though we might have very strong arguments for intervening in other areas where the positive impact isn't as easily quantifiable. And it's one of the reasons why I've been um, well, this is something that as a as an effective altruist previously, I fell into the trap of, um, either discounting systemic change or more generally um, discounting the ability to achieve things that aren't quantifiable, aren't as easily quantifiable. Um, so it does make it difficult, of course, to measure and compare these different interventions. Um, oh yeah, sorry, I keep on saying EA. My apologies. It's lovely having an expanded viewer base, but a lot of my longer term viewers are more familiar with the lingo. EA is effective altruism, so it's essentially the idea that we have limited resources available and that we should do the most good, however we want to measure good, that we can with those limited resources. And in order to achieve that, we need to do research and use rationality to find out what the most promising interventions are. And and yeah, there are many. Oh, sorry, you were referring to the. I misread your comment, J-Tibbs. You're referring to that Facebook group, not the people in here. Um, but yeah, there are a lot of those effective altruist Facebook groups uh, that have kind of fallen by the wayside a little bit. Um, yeah, it can get weird talking with people who aren't as familiar with EA, with effective altruism, about some of the sort of strange conclusions. Um, right. Okay. I've been going nearly 2.5 hours. That's longer than I thought. I was going to bugger off an hour ago or something, but then Geek with Garth came in along with all of his buddies, and I just have to give the people something. Um, so thank you very much for everyone watching, both new viewers and my long-time viewers. I say long time, I've only been going for 2 months or so, but some of you have been there since the start or close to it. So yeah, exactly, give the people what they want, and it's nice that quite a few people have stuck around. I'm pleased to see that. Hopefully you've found it interesting. I usually do uh, chatting about like science and the interface between science and politics and ethics, and yeah, I'm a researcher at Oxford. My background is in neuroscience, and if you liked my shit, do give me a follow or go subscribe to my YouTube or Twitters or whatever. Um, so yeah, thank you very much. Peace indeed. I'll give the Vulcan salute as well. On Friday, I will be making a cocktail. Not sure which one. Oh no, I am. I'm going to do the Sazerac. I'm going to make a predominantly rye-based Sazerac. So stay tuned for that if you've ever wanted to make New Orleans finest. I was about to say New Orleans finest cocktail, but the Vieux Carré is very good. Anyway, one of New Orleans' finest cocktails. And also, I will be playing some video games and doing some more chatting. So, yeah, have a delightful evening, afternoon, morning, delete as appropriate to your geographic location. And I will see you on, or at least I'll see myself in the screen on Friday. Alright,